Okay, now with the same kind of enthusiasm we have applied in the first few lessons, let's keep going. We're ready to develop a schedule. And this is going to lead to a schedule model. So we went from a schedule network diagram, which had the relationship shown in order, but no times. Now we're going to add times to it and develop a schedule. My inputs are the same, the plan, the documents. Look at my documents. They are many. But think about all the inputs and outputs we've had so far. Activity lists, attributes, the network diagram. Remember, that was a diagram of the relationships. Activity resource requirements, calendars that I need to apply to this, assumptions, basis of estimates, lessons learned. It goes on and on. EEFs and OPAs. Tools and techniques I will review in the next few slides. And my output. Bam! Now I have my second of two baselines. The process called create WBS gave me my scope baseline. Now the process of develop schedule gives me my schedule baseline. This is the final approved schedule model. I have my baseline and my project schedule, the data that comes with it. Of course, calendars, project calendars. So what I mean is, what days off does the company offer? Or the various companies you're working with all have to be accounted for in the work package, in the work activities. Change requests, as I develop schedules, and they lead to a change request elsewhere, like in scope or cost, project plan, and document updates. Now, some of those tools that we would talk about start with critical path method. This is a precedence diagramming method. So I mentioned before, precedence diagramming method. There are many precedence diagramming methods. It's about precedence. What comes first? What comes next? Critical path method is a PDM. So is critical chain a precedence diagramming method. And critical path is the one every exam will focus on. It is the most common. And it will only ask you questions about the others in word form, but you won't have to do the math. So the math here is important. The critical path method is the longest path. This is a definition from the PMBOK. The longest path in that network, that schedule network diagram we did, which also determines the shortest time that a project can be done. Great. I just gave you a second to soak that in. The schedule will have float, or sometimes we call it slack. This is an allowable delay between some activities. And the way you determine that is a formula. I'll repeat it in a minute. But it's late start minus early start, or late finish minus early finish. I'll go over it again in a second. Now, float comes in three types. There's total float, free float, and project float. Total float is the time I can delay any particular activity without delaying the project finish date at the very end. Free float is the time I can delay any particular activity without delaying the early start date of the very next activity or the successor. And then there's project float. This is an externally imposed date on your project. That's called project float. Those definitions, very important if you're going to take the certification exam. Now be aware when I'm developing my schedule, especially in critical path method, activities that converge on each other are dangerous. They are most risky because they depend on each other. And that relates to another topic called near critical path. I can have a critical path that has no float, and a near critical path might have 1 day of float. Look at the top of the slide. Float is slack. That's allowable delay. So if I have no float or 1 day of float on two different paths, those are near critical paths. And I want to be very careful with that. So the tools in review include schedule network analysis. Now I'm going to analyze this initial schedule. So I had my schedule network diagram I added times for it, and now I want to do schedule network analysis. Is this really the best logic? Do I want to take another approach besides critical path, maybe critical chain, to do my project, etc.? Speaking of, so critical path method. Remember I said it's the longest path. The critical path is the longest path in your project. It has 0-day float, usually. And for the exam, it will have 0-day float. The critical chain method, I said that was another PDM, precedence diagramming method. When you read the short blibbit about it in the PMBOK guide, note these two different sets. Note resource dependencies and buffers. So it doesn't give you extra time, it gives you buffers. It takes time out of the schedule and puts it at the end in a buffer that the project manager controls. But to do that, the project manager needs to be very careful and manage resources. So two keywords there on any test question would be resource dependencies and buffers. Okay. Now, another tool is called resource optimization, okay, which is about the finish and start dates of the activity itself. And there are two types. There's resource leveling and resource smoothing. So resource leveling balances not demand, but demand for resources with the supply. That's about leveling it out. Resources with supply. And this may cause, this would be a test question, the critical path to change. As opposed to resource smoothing, which is going to adjust activities so my resources don't reach critical mass or their own limits. And in that case, resource smoothing, critical path does not change and completion date is not delayed. Okay. Another tool is data analysis. So we can do what if scenario. What if this happens? Then this will happen. But what if this happens? Then this will happen. Okay? And it's assessing the feasibility and schedule reserves. All right? You can also use in data analysis simulation. So you do this what if scenario analysis and simulation. In simulation, you take all your schedule times, all your known risks, all your lessons learned, etc., and you put them into a program called Monte Carlo. And it would spit out for you the probabilities of finishing the project on time or finishing the project at day 75, etc. and the risks that go with it. That's called Monte Carlo analysis. Okay. There's, I can apply leads and lags. That's another tool. We already talked about that earlier. It's not slide 82, but it's earlier in leads and lags. We talked dependencies, relationships, and leads and lags. And then there's schedule compression. There are really only two types by the book of compression, fast tracking or crashing. When I fast track, I take two activities that were normally finished to start, and now I do them in parallel at the same time. Just realize that's going to increase the need for coordination, and it also increases the chances for rework, of course. Crashing is different. Crashing is where, in a layman's way of saying it, I'm going to add money to make the project go faster. But what the formal definition is, I'm going to shorten the duration, which is, right, making the project go faster, for the least amount of cost by adding resources. And that's what crashing is about. There are other ways to speed up a project, and you want to be careful about those as a project manager. People may try to cut quality or cut scope without telling you, so be careful. Really, you only have two types of schedule compression, fast tracking and crashing. The last two tools, the PMIS, which we've talked about before, and Agile Release Planning. Okay, and that's it.